Let's break down 3 running backs and 4 wide receivers that have some sneaky upside moving into week 6 of 2024 fantasy football. Maybe these players are available on the waiver wire. Maybe they are sitting on your bench, but with a mound of injuries as we head into week 6 of the season and our second week of NFL bye weeks, you may want to consider starting these players due to their matchups or their overall upside moving into the week. All right, let's start the video with New York Giants running back Tyrone Tracy, who got the start last week in relief of Devin Singletary and had a great fantasy day, 14 total fantasy points, 129 rushing yards off of 18 touches, and added 1 reception for 1 receiving yard. But if you guys watch this game, looked really good, just looked good with the ball in his hands, and I think has certainly earned snaps moving forward, regardless of Devin Singletary's overall health. Speaking of Devin Singletary, he's only been a limited participant in practice throughout the week so far, still dealing with that groin injury. So I do think that there is a good chance that even if Singletary does play in week 6, that Tyrone Tracy still gets plenty of touches in this game. I also think there's a chance that Devin Singletary doesn't even play in week 6. And this is a fantastic matchup for the Giants running backs and for Tyrone Tracy. We look at the first 5 matchups on the season for the Bengals. We've seen a double-digit fantasy performance from Ramondre Stevenson, Isaiah Pacheco, Brian Robinson Jr., and Austin Eckler, Chuba Hubbard, and of course, Derrick Henry this past week. While they sit bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position, it feels like they've been worse than that. And overall, this defense has just been hot garbage on the season. So I think that the Giants, who have been playing pretty okay football, are going to come out and have a good opportunity at home this week against the Bengals to put up some points. I think that Tyrone Tracy could be a big part of that. I know he was a popular waiver wire addition going into last week, towards the end of the week, and then also going into week 6. But he sits at 46% roster, so this is a player that you could potentially pick up, get some points out of this week, and has sneaky upside approaching week 6. Next up is Dare Ogunbowale of the Houston Texans. This is an interesting player right now, and I think a really sneaky start for the week. This is a player that I've talked about in the last minute waiver wire video going into last week, and then the last waiver wire video that we've done for the channel going into week 6. And I think Dare is in a really good spot going into week 6 against the New England Patriots on the road here. He had 21 total touches last week, 15 on the ground, was not very efficient on the ground whatsoever, just 2 yards per carry, but 7 targets, 6 receptions, 57 receiving yards, and 14.7 fantasy points. And we go back to week 4, 15.4 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 47 receiving yards, and a game-winning touchdown. Once again, not efficient on the ground whatsoever, but it's definitely apparent that Dare is a part of the game plan with Joe Mixon out. And right now, Joe Mixon has only logged 1 practice on the week, still dealing with that ankle injury that he suffered back in week 2 on Sunday Night Football. So there's a chance Joe Mixon plays this week. Obviously, it is better for Dare's fantasy value if Mixon does not play, but I think with his skill set, which is very different than, what Dameon Pierce or Cam Akers brings to the table in terms of being a receiving back, third down back, could certainly be utilized even if Joe Mixon plays. And it is a good matchup against the New England Patriots. We look back so far on the season for the Patriots: Zach Moss, double digits in week 1. Zach Charbonnet, double digits in week 2. Breece Hall had himself a day in week 3. Braylon Allen, not bad in that matchup either. Jordan Mason balled out against them in week 4. And this past week doesn't really count because they were playing the Dolphins, but there was some success out of Raheem Mostert and Jalen Wright in this game. But I don't know if we're even counting the Dolphins as a real football team right now. But the point being is Dare sits at just 6% rostered at the time that I am recording this. And this is still a player who I'm seeing getting, picked up and added in fantasy leagues right now, but still sits at a very low roster percentage. And it's actually 9% rostered overall, but you get the point. He has some sneaky upside this week. I think regardless of if Joe Mixon plays or not, he's getting involved in this offense. He's making the most of that involvement. Maybe not so much on the ground, but at least in the passing game. And I think he is a sneaky start moving into week 6. All right, last running back I'm going to mention is Roschon Johnson of the Bears. And Roschon Johnson, a player that we've been talking about on both editions of the waiver wire videos in the past 3 weeks now. It's been a fantastic stretch of matchups for the Bears running backs with the Colts, the Rams, the Panthers, and now the Jaguars. And in that stretch, Roschon Johnson either has 10 or more fantasy points or a touchdown in every single one of those games, with his best fantasy mark on the season coming last week against the Panthers, the worst run defense in the league, with 2 touchdowns and 14.5 fantasy points. And Roschon Johnson was able to do that while DeAndre Swift had 20 fantasy points and 21 touches, as well as 2 targets and 2 receptions in that game. So I still think Swift is obviously the RB1 here in what has been a confusing Bears run game on the season. But it looks like it's starting to come to life with these matchups, right? Swift is the guy here, but Roschon Johnson still gets enough involvement. 10 touches last week, is getting goal line work, 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. That I think here against the Jaguars run defense, giving up the 26 most fantasy points to the position so far on the season, is a great sneaky start if you are desperate at the position. He sits at 38% rostered. He is a player that you may be able to pick up off of the waiver wire and plug in. We look at what the Jaguars have done in the first 5 games of the season. They have allowed a rushing touchdown in every game so far on the year. They have given up a total of 528 rushing yards through 5 games. Running backs are feasting against this Jags run defense, okay? So, I do like Roschon Johnson a lot. I know that DeAndre Swift is in front of him, but we have to look at this Jaguars run defense right now and just say, overall, this is a defense that we are trying to exploit. I mean, not just at the running back position. Overall, they have been bottom 10 against every offensive position: quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, in terms of fantasy points allowed. Roschon Johnson is getting goal line work. Like I said, 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, 2 double-digit fantasy performances in the last 3 weeks. He's out there. You need someone to plug in. He's got plenty of sneaky upside as we approach week 6. All right, first wide receiver we're going to talk about is Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys, currently sitting at 48% rostered. And I personally believe that roster percentage needs to go up. This is a player we talked about in last week's last-minute waiver wire additions video on last Saturday. With no Brandon Cooks in this offense, and we don't know how long Brandon Cooks is going to be out. He's currently on IR, dealing with that, knee infection. It's a bad situation. Jalen Tolbert is in line to just keep stepping up and being the primary wide receiver 2 on this team behind CeeDee Lamb. I know we've seen a little bit involvement out of Kevontae Turpin, but the guy that you want right now in fantasy is Jalen Tolbert. He's got a good chemistry with Dak Prescott. Reportedly, throughout training camp, throughout the offseason, while CeeDee Lamb was holding out, it was all Jalen Tolbert. I mean, this was a guy practicing one-on-one with Dak Prescott, and the guy that was there during training camp who had to play as a wide receiver 1 when CeeDee Lamb wasn't there. So there's great chemistry between Tolbert and Dak. We saw that with the game-winning touchdown on 4th down against the Pittsburgh Steelers in Sunday Night Football. And overall, Tolbert has had a solid season. 2, bust weeks, but other than that, double digits in 3 out of 5 matchups so far on the season, and he gets a great matchup this week against a bad Lions secondary. I mean, yes, the Lions secondary has shown some improvement as the season has gone on, but overall, through the first 4 games of the season, they've allowed over 1,100 total passing yards, and they've allowed some really good fantasy stat lines to number 1 and number 2 wide receivers. We look at the Rams in week 1 with Cooper Kupp having a great night. Yes, Cooper Kupp did play football this season, if you guys had forgotten. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans in week 2, Marvin Harrison Jr. in week 3. Week 4, while it was a little scattered between, Metcalf, JSN, and Lockett, and no one really had a fantastic fantasy outing, there was certainly plenty of yards allowed in that game. So this is a great matchup for Jalen Tolbert, and the defensive pressure has to go to CeeDee Lamb, right? That's the nice thing with Tolbert. He's got a great wide receiver one alongside of him. So I think he's going to have another great week here in week 6. And I think after week 6, we might see that roster percentage increase even more. So if Tolbert's out there, he is a great plug and play as we approach the week. I'm so confident in Jalen Tolbert that I would head straight to Underdog Fantasy and take the over on his receiving yard line, currently sitting at 44.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in 2 of the last 4 games and barely missed it in week 3. And I think he has a strong chance once again against this Lions secondary to hit that in week 6. Don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are going to get a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's action. Take your free pick'em, pair it with one of Jalen Tolbert's lines for the week, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. And moving along, let's talk about another Chicago Bears player, and that's going to be Odunze. Rookie wide receiver has kind of had a weird year, right? We saw what we thought was going to be the breakout game in week 3 against an awful Colts defense. And then in the past 2 weeks, he's had 2 really strong matchups against the Rams and the Panthers. And we've continued to see this offense progress and get better. And he hasn't done a whole lot, but he did have 6 targets last week, 5 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and 9 fantasy points. I think this could be another matchup where Odunze pops again and has a similar performance to what we saw in week 3 when he scored 23.4 fantasy points. This Jaguars pass defense, I mean, the run defense is bad. The defense is awful overall, but the pass defense is so bad. Through the first 5 games of the season, they've given up over 1,500 total passing yards. It has been just abysmal. When we look at what they allowed to the Colts last week, and this is kind of a similar setup where we've got DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Odunze. Compare that to Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, and Alec Pierce. And Alec Pierce had a big week last week with low volume, just 3 targets, 3 receptions for 134 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 22.4 fantasy points. So I think this is a really good spot for Odunze, who acts as a wide receiver 3 and doesn't really need a ton of volume to potentially pop. But we also saw Josh Downs have 15.9 fantasy points and Michael Pittman have 14.7. And even, their wide receiver 4, A.D. Mitchell, came out of the game with 9.1 fantasy points, albeit that was a big shootout. I don't know if we're going to quite get a huge shootout, but we are going to see the Bears play well against this awful Jags defense. So Odunze, I think, is in a spot where he can have another one of these games where comes out, gives a big performance before the bye week in week 7 for the Bears. It's a great matchup. I like just about all the Bears players going into the week, but Odunze has been one of these players that you might roster him. You're right, not you might not. He still sits at 80% rostered. It's probably going to be difficult to trust him. I think this is a week we take a chance and throw Odunze into our starting lineups. Right, speaking of fantasy players that are difficult to trust, I think Rashod Bateman might be atop the list of all-time fantasy wide receivers that we never want to trust. But here's a wide receiver in a great offense with a great matchup going into a game where a lot of people are expecting points on both sides, great offenses, poor secondaries on both sides here. And Rashod Bateman has a touchdown and double-digit fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 matchups. Week 4, just 1 target, 1 reception, but just not necessary at all whatsoever in a game where the Ravens were running the football all over the place. Not that they didn't do that in week 3 as well. But I think that Bateman is really interesting here because he is the true wide receiver 2 on this team. He has more volume on the season than Nelson Agholor. Of course, we see those tight ends get involved. And of course, Zay Flowers is the wide receiver 1 here. And what the Ravens want to do first and foremost is run the football between Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. But once again, I love this matchup. The Washington Commanders giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They've allowed over 1,000 receiving yards to wide receivers through the first 5 games of the season. They played a little bit better, don't get me wrong, against the Browns at home, but I think this will be a little bit different of a matchup. I don't know if they're going to be fully capable of controlling this Ravens offense as a whole. So Bateman At the moment, very lowly rostered, sitting at just 15% rostered. You need someone to pick up last minute. You're in a bind, bye weeks, injuries. It's a good matchup. I'm expecting points from both of these offenses this week. He's got some sneaky upside as we approach week 6. All right, I usually only go through 6 players for this video, but I'm going to do a bonus player who I just really wanted to talk about for the week, and that is Ray Mccloud of the Atlanta Falcons. And I think I'm just happy because in a dynasty format, a dynasty league, I needed a player to plug in last minute last week. Bye weeks, injuries getting to me, and I picked up Ray Mccloud last minute, plugged him in, and he was part of the reason why I won my matchup last week. But he does have double digits in the last 2 weeks and 7 or more targets in the last 2 weeks, 5 or more targets in every game except for week 3 so far on the season. We're seeing this Falcons offense just continue to progress, gel together, open up. Definitely saw that on display in week 5 against the Buccaneers. And I think that Ray Mccloud in a great matchup against the Panthers this week, who have given up over 1,100 total passing yards to opposing offenses through the first 5 games of the season, and have just been a weak defense overall, is in a really good spot if you need someone to just play due to bye weeks, injuries, all that stuff going on, sitting at 27% rostered. I have seen him get picked up in a few leagues that I'm in on the week so far, but he's certainly very lowly rostered. Could be a great plug and play. And I just got one of those feelings. I think he's going to have a solid week. You know, I think this may not be a super competitive game. Maybe it will be. It is a road game for the Falcons, but I'm expecting points out of this Falcons offense. And Ray Mccloud, no touchdown so far on the season. I got a sneaky suspicion this could be his first game where he scores a touchdown. But nonetheless, if he's getting 5 or more targets, 7 or more targets like we've seen in the last 2 games, I think he will have a solid outing against the Panthers. Good matchup for Ray Mccloud. He's a sneaky start as we approach week 6. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your sneaky starts as we approach week 6 of the season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever as we approach the weekend, make sure to drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video. Don't forget, we've got everything that you could possibly need for week 6 of the fantasy season here on the channel. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, buy low targets, players that you absolutely cannot bench, waiver wire videos, even more content coming out throughout the weekend, and plenty of live fantasy Q&A streams as well. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.